The first time he saw her, she was already dead. But her eyes were staring straight back at him, sharp and almost amused, as if she had been waiting 140 years for someone to notice the lie. The photograph lay under the glass of his desk, like any other Victorian portrait. A young woman in an immaculate dress, hands folded, lips curved in a sweet, restrained smile. Yet the longer he looked, the more that smile felt less like an expression and more like a threat. Elliot Marsh was used to the dead, not in the way coroners were, or undertakers. His dead arrived on his table sealed in cardboard tubes and acid-free envelopes, wrapped in tissue instead of linen shrouds. They smelled of dust and chemicals, not of earth. Their faces were frozen on paper, sepia, silver gelatin, albumin, staring out from a century that believed portraits could hold a soul in place if you posed long enough and prayed hard enough. He had spent 15 years in the conservation wing of the Royal Photographic Archive, reversing mildew in time with distilled water, Japanese tissue, and a magnifying visor that made him look, to visiting schoolchildren, like a disappointed insect. He cleaned, flattened, mended, and catalogued lives that had evaporated before anyone in the building was born. The job required patience, reverence, and a certain emotional distance. You could not carry every sad pair of Victorian eyes home with you. But this photograph refused to stay where he put it. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in an unmarked courier pouch, accompanied by a short, apologetic email from the Acquisitions Department. Private purchase at the Ashworth sale. Provenance unclear, but date and process match 1880s Manchester. Very fragile. Please assess condition and conservation needs before we decide on display. Ashworth. The name tickled some distant memory. A footnote in a book about textile fortunes, maybe. Or a case study in industrial philanthropy and private cruelty. Elliot skimmed the intake form, noted the keywords: family portrait, young woman, albumin print, severe silvering, surface scratches, suspected retouching. He slit the tape, eased back the foam, and slid the mount out. For a moment he thought they had sent him the wrong image. There was nothing particularly unusual about it at a glance. The young woman sat in three-quarter view, head turned, just enough that her gaze seemed to rest somewhere over the photographer's shoulder. Her hair was arranged in heavy, glossy waves, pinned back with small ribbons. The dress was high-necked and sober, but clearly expensive. Fine striped silk with lace at the cuffs and throat. In the soft background blur, a painted column and balustrade suggested a balcony overlooking a garden that did not exist. It was the sort of respectable studio portrait upper-middle-class families commissioned when they wanted to prove to themselves and to each other that everything was in its proper place. Except it wasn't. Elliot's eyes were trained to notice damage first. The silver mirroring along the darker areas, the faint crease that ran diagonally across the lower right corner, catching the light. The cluster of tiny abrasions near her left shoulder, where some careless hand had once dragged a fingernail. Then he saw the pupils. They were wrong. Most Victorian portraits shared the same slightly vacant look. Long exposures, harsh lighting, and the effort of staying still for 30 seconds or more gave everyone that faintly stunned, over-civilized stare. But this was different. Her pupils were small, pinpoints in irises that seemed just a shade too clear, too flat. There was no softness, no variation, no tiny reflection of the lens or the window you expected in a wet plate portrait. They looked painted. Elliot leaned closer, forgetting to breathe. and the overhead lamp slipped from a general wash of light into a tight, unforgiving circle. Her smile followed. From a distance, it was unremarkable that prim Victorian half-curve women adopted when they wanted to look pleasant but not vulgar. Up close, magnified by his visor, the corners of her mouth betrayed the pose. The skin there was taut, almost pinched, as if something just out of frame were pulling upward. There were no soft creases at the cheeks, no faint dimples, none of the tiny crinkles near the eyes that accompany an honest smile. Someone had sculpted this expression from a face that did not want to move. Elliot set the print down carefully and sat back. Albumin? Cabinet card format? Heavy studio retouching? He murmured into the recorder clipped to his collar, because narration kept his hands steady. Approximate date, 1880-1885. Subject female, late teens. Condition, fair, some silver mirroring and surface abrasion. Notable anomalies in eyes and mouth, possible overpainting or mechanical alteration. He paused, listening to his own voice echo faintly in the quiet lab. Subject's expression reads as unnatural. The word felt inadequate. He turned off the recorder. Most conservation work began with water. Humidification to relax old paper, distilled droplets to lift dirt. This one demanded a different first step. Verification. If someone in the 1880s had retouched the eyes, it would show under raking light or infrared. If they had done something worse, if this was as a small, unwelcome part of his mind whispered, one of those post-mortem photographs no one liked to talk about outside specialist circles, it would show in the body. He dimmed the overheads and switched on the cold fiber optic spot, angling it low across the surface. The texture of the print rose up under the grazing light like topography. Fine craquelure in the darker shadows. The faint, almost invisible brush strokes around the pupils. There and gone in a blink. They were painted. Someone had sharpened her gaze with pigment, chasing the illusion of aliveness into a pair of glassy, unblinking eyes. His stomach tightened. Victorians had been obsessed with death in ways that made modern people flinch. Post-mortem portraits of children arranged as if asleep. Infants propped between parents, their limp hands supported by hidden stands. Elliot had seen dozens in special collections, usually clearly labeled, their purpose understood. The photograph didn't just tell him she was dead. It told him who had killed her, just not in words anyone in 1885 had cared to read. It was there in the angle of her neck, too straight for sleep, in the choice of dress, too celebratory for mourning, and in the single, heavy line of ink on the back of the card that turned a polite studio portrait into a confession. He found the writing when he flipped the card to log its dimensions. Most cabinet portraits from the 1880s carried the same predictable information on their reverse. The photographer's name in ornate script, the studio address, maybe a little flourish. By appointment to Her Majesty. Prizes awarded at the Great Exhibition. Families occasionally added a polite note. To Aunt Margaret, with love, 1883. A date, a name. This one bore only 3 elements. At the bottom, in the printed gold of the studio logo, H. Mullins, portrait artist, Deansgate, Manchester. Above that, written in iron gall ink that had browned and eaten slightly into the paper, C. Ashworth, March 1885. And pressed into the cardstock so hard the nib had almost torn through, a single line in darker, shakier script. She will behave now. Elliot stared at the sentence, at the way the last word trailed off in a faint blot, as if the hand that wrote it had trembled. He had read enough 19th-century letters to recognize male handwriting, the authoritative downward strokes of a man used to signing checks and contracts, not the looping, careful curves of a daughter labeling her own likeness. Whoever inscribed this hadn't done it for her. He typed C, Ashworth, Manchester, 1885, Mullins Deansgate, into the archive terminal out of habit, not expecting much. The database spat back a thin report of a recent acquisition. Ashworth Collection, Sale Lot 47, domestic papers and photographs. Late Victorian. No further description. No contextual essay. The collection hadn't been processed yet. He should have logged condition notes, filled out the worksheet, moved on to the next print in the queue. Instead, an hour later, he was sitting in the cold reading room with a thin gray box in front of him, and that line, "She will behave now," wedged somewhere uncomfortably under his ribs. The Ashworth papers smelled of old smoke and starch. Inside the box, bundles of letters lay tied with faded ribbon, their folds crisp and unforgiving. A family Bible, its leather cracked, a small ledger, 3 school copybooks, a square of silk mottled with ancient perfume, and tucked near the bottom, a diary. The label on the envelope identified it as belonging to E. Ashworth, 1884-1886. Elliot slid it out, mindful of the fragile spine. The handwriting inside marched in neat rows, each date marked with an efficient flourish. This was not a young girl's journal of confessions and crushes. This was an account book of a man's conscience, except there was very little conscience on display. January 12th. Meeting with mill foreman. Output satisfactory. February 3rd. Caroline again obstinate about Hartley boy. Unacceptable. March 2nd. Doctor called. Girl claims fatigue, likely dramatics. There it was. A name. Caroline. He turned pages carefully, watching the story thicken in the spaces between the lines. Caroline. Too familiar with one of the mill workers. Caroline. Refusing a respectable match. Caroline. Threatening, in her father's words, to drag the Ashworth name into the mud of the factory floor. He could almost hear the voice, clipped and cold, behind each sentence. March 10th. Confrontation with C over her intentions. Raised my voice. She hysterical. Spoke of love. Nonsense. March 14th. C. Unwell. Doctor says fever. Prescribed rest. March 16th. C. No better. Complains of stomach pain, weakness. March 18th. C. Deceased. 3:40 a.m. The ink here changed. The line wavered more than the others. March 21st. Photographic appointment with Mullins. Insisted C be presented properly. Paid extra. There was nothing else on that page. Elliot closed the diary and sat very still. Victorian men did not record their sins in direct prose. They left them in omissions and euphemisms. No mention of arsenic or bottles, no recorded threats, just the steady erosion of a daughter's will under a father's expectations and a sudden, convenient death. He went back to the photograph. Under the brighter reading room lamps, the staging was even more obscene. The dress, he now knew, was not chosen at random. He recognized it from a rough charcoal sketch tucked into one of the letter bundles. A young woman in a striped silk gown, hand resting lightly on the arm of a chair. The note beneath in a younger, more elegant script. For Caroline's engagement, as discussed. The sketch was signed by a modiste on King Street. The engagement that had never happened. The dress that had been readied for a future that would not be allowed. He imagined Edmund Ashworth, the E whose hand had recorded her illness in such clipped phrases, standing in Mullins's studio 3 days after the funeral. the smell of chemicals and damp plaster, the creak of the posing chair. "Not like that," Edmund would say, voice tight. "Not sleeping. She must look alive. Sit her up. Eyes open. She was a stubborn girl, Mr. Mullins, but beautiful. I will not have people remember her as weak." Mullins, for his part, had written his own version of that day in a small notebook. Elliot found it tucked into another folder, a working journal the photographer's descendants had sold with the papers. March 21st, 1885. Session most disturbing. Gentleman insisted deceased daughter be posed as if alive. Brought dress, jewels. Spoke to her as though she might answer. I protested. Only meant to photograph the dead in repose as is custom. He would not relent. Demanded work until proper effect achieved. Hands unsteady after. Elliot could almost feel the tremor in the words. By the time Elliot realized the photograph was still working on the living, it was too late to pretend this was just another Victorian tragedy, safely sealed in the past. The pattern was too clean, too cruel. Every person who had kept Caroline's image close had watched their own family slowly buckle under the same invisible weight. Control, silence, and a smile that meant the opposite of what it showed. It started with a footnote in a legal letter. At first, Elliot had only been hunting for an ending. Caroline died. The father commissioned his grotesque portrait. Life went on, the file would close, but the deeper he dug into the Ashworth papers, the more the story did the opposite of ending. It branched. There was always another hand adding another page, another generation adjusting the frame but never daring to take the photograph down. The solicitor's letter from 1902 was the hinge. On thick, yellowing paper, in a careful hand, it laid out the distribution of Edmund Ashworth's estate. The mills divided between his two surviving sons, Robert and Arthur, the Manchester townhouse on Brookfield Terrace, certain investments, a modest sum for the upkeep of family graves. It was all as dry and predictable as any other industrialist's will, until the postscript. Mr. Ashworth requested that the portrait of his daughter Caroline, presently displayed in the study, remain in that room and pass with the house to his heir. The picture is to be considered part of the property and is not to be removed or destroyed. Elliot read the line twice. You did not usually see specific instructions about a single photograph in a will, not unless it was worth a small fortune or contained a royal signature. This was a studio portrait of a merchant's daughter, except it wasn't. It was a confession nailed to a wall and ordered to stay there. He imagined the study. Dark wood, heavy curtains, smell of cigar smoke and coal fire. Above the desk, Caroline's forced smile presiding over ledgers and letters, Edmund dying with that gaze on the back of his neck, then his son sitting at the same desk, under the same gaze, because the will said so. The next document in the bundle was from 1908, a letter from Robert Ashworth to his younger brother. Brookfield is unchanged, Robert had written. Father's chair, father's books, father's portrait of C still exactly as he left them. Mother urged me to move it to the parlor, says the study feels like a mausoleum with her watching, but there is the stipulation in the will and I have no wish to be seen breaking it. In any case, she seems to comfort him, even now. Ridiculous, I know. Comfort. Elliot stared at the word. It did not fit anything he had read so far. Maybe comfort was what men called the habits that held them together, when everything else threatened to slip. Maybe comfort was what a guilty man felt, when the proof of his crime hung exactly where he expected it to be, unmoved and unchallenged. A second letter, dated 3 years later, peeled away the polite veneer. "I confess," Robert wrote to a school friend, "that I have lately considered removing Caroline from the study. Not for reasons of sentiment, but of sleep. Since Father's death, I have had the strangest sensations while working at his desk, that someone stands just behind my left shoulder. Turn around, and of course the room is empty, yet her eyes in the picture seem changed. Do not think me mad. I am merely tired. The mills demand attention, and the house is full of Father in every corner." The letter ended with a half-hearted joke about inheriting ghosts along with dividends. Elliot pinched the bridge of his nose, willing away the prickle at the base of his skull. He did not believe in ghosts. He believed in chemicals and trauma and the way objects could act as containers for the things people refuse to say out loud. Hang a portrait long enough above a desk where decisions are made, and it will warp every choice made under it, even if no one consciously looks up. The correspondence leapt forward a generation. Robert died in 1932. The townhouse passed to his only son, Henry, a man more interested in motor cars and investments than weaving machines. Henry's letters were brisk, modern, sprinkled with slang. Yet even he, in a note to a cousin about renovating the old study, wrote, "Can't do anything about the damned photo, though, because of grandfather's instructions. The lawyer says the clause has no real force now, but Mother would have kittens if I dared to remove poor dear Caroline from her throne. She says it would anger Father's memory. Personally, I think it's just bad taste to let the servants dust around a corpse with lipstick. Corpse with lipstick." Elliot thought of the brush strokes he'd seen around Caroline's mouth, the powder carefully stippled into her cheeks to fake warmth. Generations later, the family had dropped the Victorian euphemisms and called it what it was. A later scrap, undated, written in a less steady version of Henry's hand, recorded, "Elsie says the girl gives her nightmares. Says she dreams the woman in the study is trying to stand up out of the frame. Might send Elsie to Mother's till we change the room." In the margin, somebody, another hand, perhaps a wife, had added, "You will never change anything in that room." The archive file thinned as it moved into the 1960s, but what remained felt less like history and more like an echo of something that refused to die out. There was a brief note from an insurance inspector who had evaluated the property after a minor fire in the kitchen. Study unaffected. Portrait of female ancestor above desk noticeably darkened by smoke. Owner declined recommendation to move or store picture elsewhere. Even when the house itself had nearly burned, they had left Caroline exactly where she was. Then the tone of the documents shifted. The last Ashworth to own Brookfield Terrace was Michael, Edmund's great-grandson, born in 1942. His presence in the box appeared not as neat letters on cream paper, but as photocopies of statements taken in 1974, when the house and its contents were finally sold. In the stiff, impersonal format of an interview, Michael's voice still managed to break through. "Yes, the photograph. It hung in my father's study when I was a boy. I was never allowed to touch it. My parents said it was Great-Aunt Caroline, who died young. I remember being told to say goodnight to her when Father worked late. Kiss your aunt and off to bed. That sort of thing." Elliot could picture it too clearly. A small boy standing on tiptoe, pressing his lips to the cold gloss of a dead girl's face, because generations had decided that was what one did in that room. The statement continued. As I grew older, I came to dislike the room. The smile in the portrait, it sounds absurd, seemed to change depending on where I stood. At Father's side, it looked kindly enough. If I sat in his chair, alone, it took on a different quality, critical almost. If I had a poor report from school, I could barely bring myself to look up. Under the typed line, in blue ink, someone had added, "Subject laughs at this point, appears embarrassed." But the next paragraph was not amusing at all. After my father's death, I moved into the study as head of the household. It was then I began to experience what I can only call hallucinations. At night, when working, I would hear footsteps behind me, though the door was locked. Once I woke in the chair to find I had dreamed of her standing beside the desk, eyes level with mine, saying, "He did this to me. You must take me down." When I awoke, of course, she was back in the frame. I told myself it was stress. The interviewer's question was preserved in the transcript. "Is this why you decided to sell the house?" Michael's answer, "Not at first. I could have learned to live with a guilty conscience, as my ancestors apparently did. What I could not live with was the effect it had on my daughter. She was 5. She began waking at night, screaming about the sad lady in the study who sat on the edge of her bed. She said the lady wanted to tell her a secret about her father. She used words a child should not know. Poison. Locked room. My wife insisted we remove the photograph, but I felt trapped by family expectation. Absurd, I know. A legal clause from 1902 haunting a man in 1973. There was a pause in the text before the final admission. When my daughter started refusing to go upstairs alone, saying the lady was angrier now, I instructed our solicitor to arrange the sale of the property and all fixtures and furnishings as seen. I could not bear to be the one to tear it from the wall. Let someone else do it. Let them deal with her. Elliot sat back from the table, the photocopy blurring slightly as his focus slipped. Let someone else deal with her. Someone else had. The house changed hands. The portrait left the study finally for the first time in almost 90 years. It passed from collector to collector, losing its name in the process. Somewhere along the way, it had stopped being Caroline Ashworth and become simply unnamed Victorian girl, a curiosity. It surfaced at a London auction where an anonymous bidder, with a taste for the macabre, acquired it for a private collection. 15 years later, it landed on Elliot's desk. The pattern was not a curse, he told himself. It was psychology. Generation after generation, an image embodying unresolved guilt had been treated as a relic, placed where decisions were made and secrets were kept. Children were taught to salute it, adults to justify it, everyone to ignore the wrongness they felt when they looked too long. That kind of pressure did not need ghosts to warp people. It only needed silence. Yet knowing that did not make the hair on his arms lie flat. He flipped back through the file, tracing the unspoken lines between documents. Edmund, who preferred a dead, obedient daughter to a living, disobedient one. Robert, who felt watched, but left the portrait where it was. Henry, who called it a corpse with lipstick, and still did nothing beyond jokes. Michael, who finally ran, but only by selling the responsibility to the highest bidder. Each man had had a chance to take Caroline off the wall and admit out loud what the photograph really showed. Each man had chosen instead to live under it and tell himself He was being rational. Elliot shut the box. He was not an Ashworth. He did not owe a dead industrialist anything. But he could feel the same gravitational pull now, the same pressure to file the story under interesting Victorian oddities and move on to the next piece of paper. He could also feel something else, quieter, but more insistent. A sense that Caroline's image had been used for everyone's comfort, but hers, as a punishment, a warning, a talisman of guilt. Even the people who feared it had still managed to make the fear about themselves. Her own voice, whatever might be left of it, had only ever surfaced sideways, in nightmares and nervous jokes, and the line a 5-year-old girl had spoken in 1973, "Daddy hurt me." Elliot found himself turning, almost despite himself, to look at the dark glass panel of the conservation lab's door. Through it, across the corridor, he could just make out the faint rectangle of light on his work table, the outline of the photograph under its protective mylar sheet. Even from here, her eyes seemed to catch the reflection. He exhaled, long and slow. Absurd. It was absurd to feel watched by collodion and paper. Absurd to imagine that a woman dead since 1885 cared what some conservator did or did not do with a file. Still, when he walked back into the lab, he did not sit down immediately. He went to the window, unlatched it a few inches, and let the chill evening air cut through the smell of chemicals. The city outside hummed with buses and sodium lights, a world of asphalt and glass that had never known gas lamps or hansom cabs. Then he turned to Caroline. Up close again, the technical details reasserted themselves. The fine crazing in the emulsion, the careful retouching, the optical illusions created by old varnish. Science, not spirits. Yet beneath it all, the composition held a rigid, obsessive intent. A father had spent a fortune and hours in a studio to manufacture this lie of perfect obedience. His sons and grandsons had spent lives pretending not to see the lie, even as it twisted their homes. And now the image sat in a public archive, waiting to be labeled, cataloged, and perhaps one day, hung in a gallery with a neat line of text like, "Unknown young woman, C, 1885, album in print, gift of a private collector." Elliot thought of that will clause again. Not to be removed or destroyed. Its legal force had faded. Its psychological force had not. What if, he said aloud, voice sounding too loud in the empty lab, we stop obeying him? He picked up his recorder, and for the first time since the photograph had arrived, spoke not just as a conservator, but as someone lodging a quiet protest into the official record. "Supplementary note," he said. "Evidence indicates subject is Caroline Ashworth, aged 19 at death, 1885. Strong circumstantial support for this being a post-mortem portrait, staged to appear as if she were alive. Subsequent family documents show the image was kept on display for nearly 90 years under explicit instruction from the father. Multiple descendants report psychological distress associated with the portrait. Recommendation: catalog not as anonymous Victorian curiosity, but as potential evidence of domestic abuse and coercive control in late Victorian industrial family. Flag for ethical review before any public exhibition." He clicked the recorder off. It was a small act against a century of silence. A line of digital audio and a note in a database. Yet it shifted something in him, like finally moving a piece that had sat on the same square far too long. The story was still incomplete. He knew how Caroline had died and what had been done to her body afterward. He knew how her image had ruled a house What he did not know yet was how it had left that house, changed its name, and become just another lot number in an auction catalog. Nor why in every short provenance note there were the same phrases. Disturbing atmosphere, uneasy presence, decided to sell on. If the photograph had been a weapon once in Edmund Ashworth's hands, Elliot thought, then it had become something else in the years since. A kind of silent witness, carried from room to room, house to house, generation to generation, waiting for someone to read what it actually showed. For the first time since opening the box, he felt less like a caretaker of objects and more like an investigator standing at the edge of a crime scene everyone else had walked away from. The dead did not get second chances, but sometimes their images did. And Caroline, frozen in that impossible smile, did not look like she was done speaking. The first clue that Caroline had one last move to play did not come from the photograph itself, but from something the camera had accidentally stolen along with her image. A few loose strands of hair, caught and saved by habit in a mourning locket, carrying in their keratin the kind of evidence no Victorian court could have read, but a 21st century lab could. The report lay between them on the glass table, a single sheet of university letterhead that might as well have been an indictment. Elevated arsenic levels, the curator read aloud, lips thinning. Consistent with chronic exposure, not a cosmetic trace then. No, Elliot said. Not face powder, not wallpaper. This is months of poisoning. Slow, regular doses. They were planning an exhibition called Secrets in the Archives, a glossy title for a simple idea. Objects that had turned out to mean something entirely different from what people thought. A polite letter that was actually a code. A war photograph staged for propaganda. A medieval will that hid a second, secret family. And now possibly a Victorian portrait that was not a memorial at all, but the last act in a murder. The curator tapped the edge of the photograph, which lay in its protective sleeve between them. If we show this, she said, we are not just talking about post-mortem photography. We are saying plainly that we believe her father killed her. We are saying the evidence points that way, Elliot corrected. We cannot name him as a murderer in a legal sense. He's a century and more beyond that. But we can show what we have. The hair analysis, his diary, the doctor's notes, the way he ordered her posed as if she had never disobeyed him. Let visitors decide what they think. And the descendants? She asked. There may still be Ashworths. They may not enjoy seeing great-great-grandfather Edmund framed as a Victorian Bluebeard. They sold the papers, Elliot said. They sold her picture. They invited us to look. For 100 years, that family used Caroline as an ornament of respectability. I think she's due at least one truthful label. Silence settled between them, heavy but not hostile. At last, the curator nodded. All right, she said. We do it, but we do it properly. No horror show theatrics, no cursed photograph marketing. The story is bad enough without that. Bad enough. The months that followed were a slow choreography of decisions. Which documents to show? How much of Edmund's diary to quote? Whether to reproduce Michael Ashworth's description of his daughter's nightmares, or let that remain in the archive for specialists. Elliot argued for context. If we reduce this to a spooky Victorian anecdote, he said in one planning meeting, we're repeating exactly what allowed it to happen in the first place. People will say, oh, how strange they were back then, and walk away. We need to tie it to something they recognize now. Control, coercion, the way power lets some crimes go uninvestigated. The label drafts changed. The first version called it simply Portrait of Caroline A.C. 1885. The second added, Believed Post-Mortem. The third, after another round with the Ethics Committee, read, Caroline Ashworth, 1866-1885. Album and cabinet card, taken 3 days after her death. Contemporary documents show her father insisted she be posed to appear alive. Modern analysis of preserved hair indicates chronic arsenic poisoning in the months before she died. No investigation was ever opened. For decades, this photograph hung above her father's desk and then in the family home, treated as a beloved portrait rather than potential evidence of a crime. There it was, in black and white. Not an accusation exactly, but no longer an alibi. On the morning the exhibition opened, Elliot arrived before the doors. He watched technicians adjust the light levels in the gallery. Most of the room was softly lit, objects glowing gently in their cases. Caroline's print had its own alcove, a shallow recess painted a muted gray. The photograph hung at eye level, small and deceptively ordinary, protected by museum glass that cut reflections, but not entirely the sense that she was looking back. Beside it, in a narrow case, lay 3 things: the mourning locket, open to show the pale loop of hair; a facsimile of the arsenic report; names removed, numbers stark; a diary page from March 1885, in Edmund's own stiff hand. C. Again disobedient. Situation intolerable. Steps must be taken to restore order. The line that followed, about her sudden fever, was enlarged on the wall text. Visitors began to filter in as the hour ticked over. School uniforms, headphones, couples with cameras dangling. At first they drifted past Caroline as they would past any old photograph. One more Victorian face in a building filled with them. Then they read. Elliot stood at a discreet distance and watched the expressions shift. Polite attention, then surprise, then that small, involuntary flinch most people gave when the image in front of them suddenly acquired weight. "She's dead there?" a teenager whispered to his friend. 3 days, the friend answered, reading. "Look at her eyes," an older woman murmured to the man beside her. "You can see. There's nothing there." "Why would a father do that?" someone else asked, not really expecting an answer. The questions moved through the crowd like a second current, overlaying the museum's usual low murmur. Elliot did not try to answer all of them. The wall text did some of the work. A short audio piece, if people chose to listen, explained post-mortem photography and how arsenic had seeped into everything from fabric dyes to insect poison. But the deeper reasons, pride, ownership, the way an entire society had built walls of deference around men like Edmund Ashworth, those had to be thought, not told. Mid-afternoon, a young woman in a yellow coat stood a long time in front of the photograph, arms folded tight across her chest. When she turned away, her eyes were bright. "My grandfather wasn't Victorian," she said quietly to no one in particular. "But he would have understood this man. My house, my rules, my reputation. My mother says he used to tell her the same thing. She'd be better dead than shaming the family." She caught Elliot's eye, realized he'd heard, and gave a small, almost apologetic shrug. "It's not just history," she said. "That's the worst part." "That's why it's on the wall," Elliot said. In the weeks that followed, Letters began to arrive, emails, comments in the exhibition book. Some were scholarly, debating the ethics of calling something evidence when no court had ever examined it. Others were personal in a way Eliot had not quite expected. My great-aunt was never investigated either. Reading about Caroline made me think of how my grandmother still talks about her brother, like he was perfect. Thank you for saying out loud what everyone in that family must have felt, but never dared put in writing. The story even leaked into the press, an article in a weekend supplement, illustrated with a carefully cropped reproduction of the photograph. The headline was not subtle. The Victorian father, who would rather kill than lose control. But the piece itself was better than Eliot had feared. It talked about power, about how archives could expose things no one at the time had wanted exposed, about how many Carolines had never even left a picture behind. One afternoon, as the exhibition entered its second month, Eliot returned to the gallery and found a small bunch of white flowers on the floor beneath Caroline's frame. No note, just the stems, wrapped in paper. He knelt, moved them gently to the side so the cleaners would not sweep them away, and wondered who had left them. Someone who saw themselves in her. Someone who knew too well what it was to be forced into a role for the sake of respectability. Or just someone who couldn't bear the idea that a girl had been turned into a prop for her father's conscience, and then passed from wall to wall like a family heirloom. Standing, he met Caroline stare again. The smile had not changed. It never would. The wires, the paint, the pose, those were fixed. What had changed was everything around it, the label, the story, the way strangers looked back at her and saw not a charming relic, but a young woman whose life had been collapsed into one final, grotesque performance. He thought of Michael Ashworth's line, "Let someone else deal with her." In a way, the man had gotten his wish. The museum was dealing with her now, though not, Eliot suspected, in the way Edmund or his heirs would ever have imagined. The exhibition would close. The photograph would go back into the dark, in its box, on its shelf. But it would not go back to silence. Anyone searching the catalog would see the new notes. Researchers would cite Caroline when they wrote about domestic abuse, about the ethics of mourning images, about how technology could unmask long-buried harm. She had, at last, been taken down from the study wall and placed where her story could not be controlled by a single family line. As Eliot left the gallery that evening, he had the odd sense that, for the first time since 1885, the balance around the photograph had shifted, however slightly, in her favor. Not justice, not really. Nothing could give her back the years stolen. But recognition, naming, refusing to let the forced smile do its work unchallenged. Sometimes he thought the past did not ask for proof. It demanded it. And sometimes, when the right fragments had survived, a locket, a ledger, a print on albumen paper, that proof could finally be read.